Hey everybody, it's your boy Agent Albatross here. Today we have three guests, not just our usual three, but we have one additional, Mr. GanzaGames. And today we're going to be talking conversion versus adaptation in Cypher System. What it means to do one or the other, and yeah, go ahead, Ant.
Yeah, and this quarter we have conversions with a 3-0 record. And in this quarter we have adaptations, currently undefeated and the reigning champion. Um, you could tell what my favorite is, but I want to ask what's everyone's definition of conversions to settings and genres and adaptations to settings and genres. We'll start it off with Chris. Could you give me the definition of conversions?
Well, for me, the definition of conversion is trying to find a way to kind of really get the math to like work out that you have some fidelity between the numbers, even if the numbers are different. I think especially a big document that came out just last year was Wizards of the Coast saying, hey, we have a conversion document between all the different editions, except for fourth, to fifth edition. Because that way people can take a document and then kind of cross through it and then put the new numbers in and they can play it as is and everything's set up for them.
Yeah, that's pretty much conversion in a nutshell. It's a lot of number crunching and it's a lot of additional work. Um, Dean, would you like to take adaptation's definition for us? Give it a shot.
Adaptation is a sweet spot. It literally does not require you to convert a number, twist a digit, or anything like that. Literally, what you're doing is bringing the atmosphere, the feeling, the conceptualization of another media, game, whatever, to Cypher System. And I think that works so much better. If you shift your paradigm and think about it, you're never going to get a one for one conversion, no matter how how well the person was, or who came up with the converting document. Even if you look at the document Chris was talking about, there's still argument. People are still, well, I would have did this, or I would have. With adaptation, you don't have to do that, and you just bring the flavor. And that's normally, at least for me, that's normally what the selling point is. It's like, I don't want to convert Cyberpunk to Cypher System. I just want to play in the Cyberpunk world in Cypher System because it's so much cooler. you know.
I mean, I could feel the unbiasedness of
Oh no, I'm very biased.
your definition.
I'm very
I mean,
good.
it's
I admit it.
radiating from you. But that's going to lead to our first question, and I guess we'll hand it over to Al. But which do you prefer?
Yeah, so yeah, now that we know how people define them, conversion versus adaptation, and we're talking about preference here. I'm actually a fan of both. Though adaptation is much easier to do. You're just again flavoring the setting or whatever have you within the rules of Cipher. Maybe a magic bolt instead of a magic bolt is a like a gun or something like that. It's just about adapting and maybe changing the flavoring of an ability instead of just adding mechanics or something like that. But on the other side, as far as adding mechanics or whatever have you with conversions, I'm actually a huge fan of that too, because certain things when you try to convert or adapt them to Cipher System, you kind of don't get the exact feeling. For example, with my Darkest Dungeon game, I converted a bunch of the mechanics from the game into Cipher System, but it still is using the Cipher core rules, so it's not you're not learning anything. I didn't go crazy with it. You're not learning anything brand new, basically. Um, and again, that's where conversion shines, where you trying to capture these little nuances of a media. For this instance would be like a video game, capturing a video game mechanic within the Cypher System. Conversion's kind of not needed is a strong word, but depending on the circumstances, is almost needed to convert like a little mechanic to Cypher System to really get that feel. And yeah, they both have their strong suits, and I like using both of them.
Chris, you want to chime in on this?
For a long time, I was trying to make conversions, and it was, even when you're with yourself, you have arguments about, well, is this number or that number. And then I got into Savage Worlds. And if you're not familiar with Savage Worlds, they basically, it's quick and dirty. And that was like my first step from going to like faithful conversions to quick and dirty conversions, where you get a little fidelity, but you're not trying to hang up on things. And if you haven't seen the community for Savage Worlds, everything, in fact, they call it savaging a system. They're savaging a setting. They don't even call it converting. They're just like, we savaged it. And part of that also is because with Savage Worlds, for those who play Cypher, this is going to be familiar. You redress things. You don't, a lightning bolt could be a psionic bolt, could be, that's how it works. In Savage Worlds, they're a little more like, trade-offs. Like if you have flame, well, then this may work, but that may not work. But the core ability is the same, whether you're a wizard or a scientist or a psionicist. And then after that, I kind of just went into now I do adaptions. I have a product, Mortal Fantasy out. I consider it much more of an adaptation than a conversion, because, I do things that help do little bits of fidelity or homage to a concept. But overall, a lot of the stuff is still the same, or those things I took, they were still in Cypher. I just kind of put them in a new spot to get that feeling going. So I definitely lean much more towards adaptions now, unless it's like just the conversion is from one edition to another edition of a game.
That'll lead us to Dean.
I played in L's Darkest Dungeon game, and I know he said it was a conversion, but it wasn't. He adapted Cypher to a video game because there was no new mechanics, there was no odd one-for-ones. Everything that he did within the realm of what he brought to the table was still so Cypher, even though I felt like I was in a damn video game. It was brilliant. Mm-hmm. And I think maybe it's just a language thing, because I think people who understand Cypher System are just naturally predisposed to the element of converting, because not going to mention any names or anything like that, but there are people that I've encountered who will go into these long tirades about converting and bringing all of this excess, and they're trying to get these one-for-one nuances, and they're lost. And most of their stuff is a hot mess, a very, very, very hot, smelly mess,
Tell us how you really feel about that.
I'm just saying, it's.
Don't hold back.
But I'm just saying. Whereas anybody who kind of understands the nuance and the, use Chris's word, fidelity, and I'll say, or the harmony of Cypher System, you actually drive anything you do within the parameters of how the system is set up. It's modular. There are pieces and parts. There are other things that you can do. There are other portions of Cypher System, like, for example, the horror rules or the shock rules that you can adapt. I run a horror game, and one aspect in the horror game, instead of having the horror mode or the shock mode, I added the madness moment. But I use the same ruling. It works the same way, but all madness does is cause you to have, there's like, when you're within the game, you become confused. You can't function at 100% because you're going mad. But it's the same functionality as just like the shock rules, or the same functionality as the horror rule. So that's my 2 cents. How about you, man?
I kind of agree with Dean for the most part, but I do think, to go back on Darkest Dungeon, I'm definitely on the adapting side. But there was some rule changes, and I think when you add a rule that isn't existing in the core Cypher book, then that is considered a conversion. It could be a small rule. Do I think it was a full conversion? No, but I think he did have conversion elements into that Darkest Dungeon game. But I do agree that for the most part, it wasn't adapting. He adapted the game, but he did have conversion elements into it. I think Cypher System as a whole is so interchangeable, the rule set parts are so interchangeable that it lends itself better to adapting as opposed to reinventing the wheel and converting. You know, like if I say we took something like Babylon 5 and you know, you guys know me, I love to take existing settings and IPs and run one shots with them, and I'm lazy. So I don't want to spend 2 weeks or a week and a half converting, figuring out, changing numbers, adding rules. Like, you know, if I'm doing Star Wars, you know, I have to add a force rule. No, I'd rather reflavor existing rules to make it fit. I'm currently working on Snakes on an Airplane, which is a mashup between Snakes on a Plane and Airplane the movie. And I want to use the shock rules as a laugh track rule. It's the same premise, but when we get to the point where when a certain scenes are going to have they're going to have to improv a joke as opposed to being scared or horror. I'm working out the details, but I'm using the same rules and I'm just adapting it to a comedic setting. So I definitely believe in adapting wholeheartedly, but there's room for conversions. And let's be realistic about it too. Most people are not used to narrative games. So conversions, believe it or not, is probably the more fall to when it comes to, hey, I want to make a setting on non-Cypher related games. So people's minds tend to go to conversions first opposed to adaptation.
Right. Agreed.
In fact, I think for people who start to eventually adapt, they have to go through that conversion step.
Absolutely.
Find out what level of conversion they're comfortable with, or just like adapting. In fact,
I was going to say, leading into me talking about Snakes on an Airplane, what is your approach when you want to, what you call it, adapt something, an existing IP or a setting or a cool idea you have to Cypher? So what would be your approach? What would be your first steps? If let's pick a random. We spoke about Wild West earlier, so let's pick let's say The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. Do you guys know that movie? Everybody heard that?
I don't, but I know enough about westerns, I guess.
All right, so let's say we want to do A Good, the Bad, and the Ugly Western adaptation to Cypher. So who wants to go first?
I'll lead off on that because I don't really know too much about the movie specifically, but westerns, you know, it's cowboy stuff, whatever have you, right? So instead of like saying, hey, I need to come up with an ability where someone could lasso and tie someone up, right? But instead we just look at entangling force or whatever it is called, and I think that's what it's called in the book. And you say, hey, instead of whatever, like a psychic force, it's a rope that I'm throwing, and that's the flavor of it. And there was no need to come up with a lassoing rule or ability or anything because we just adapted entangling force to that.
Yeah, that absolutely works. Now, if you were converting it, you would have to you would have to say, hey, you know, what's it's not a light immediate weapon, it's a restraining weapon, and then we will have to figure out
the length of the rope, how long can it be, how much distance can he throw it, you know. You'd have to figure out all sorts of other accuracy based ideas. You know, and I think conversion takes the fun because it's also adding excess mechanics. You know, you said it the best, Al, with, you know, just using entangling force, you know, turning it instead of a lasso, instead of a magical ability, it's a freaking physical item, but you get to use it.
So what would your approach be to adapting Western style to Cypher?
Me or Al?
Oh, you.
Well, me, the biggest thing is anything I adapt, the first thing I look at is the genre and the flavor. So I worry so little about a mechanic or anything else and look at how am I going to bring that world into the narrative? That's my first initial approach. Then, everything else kind of starts sliding into place because, um, typically people would look at things. It's just like prime example, you talk about the conversion aspect. Prime example is like reflavoring things to make them work, or even in the types. For example, maybe the fastest gun in the West, isn't a warrior. He might be an adept, because, he's got onslaught ability. Okay, so that onslaught ability is now his pistol.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? Fire step. Take fire step. Fire step is no longer fire step, but it's barrel roll, because he can dodge out of the way. Little aspects, rethinking you're thinking outside the box on how you want to approach your characters. And I think for converting, that's what I do. I look at the flavor of the setting and the high aspects of the types of characters, and then how do you put them into Cypher? And it's so easy because it kind of all comes to me. Like I said, I've never even thought about that whole concept with the gunslinger being an adept, but you just gave me something else to add into my Western game that I'm going to go switch around some characters.
And for the record, I didn't mention Wild West to any of these guys before it came out of my mouth when we started shooting the video.
Right.
But that's actually a great. You also brought up a great point about that foci. Just because it abilities with a focus doesn't mean that it has to stay in that focus. So you could take any ability that comes from a foci or even a flavor and add it on to something else and swap and change. So it's so easy to adapt. But Chris, if you was thinking of Wild West and you was thinking you wanted to adapt, what would be your thought process?
Well, for me, especially if I was getting super serious about it, I would think of those iconic moments that I would want the players to experience and enjoy, and have them available. Perfect example, we talked about the horror rule, right? Which Mighty Cook Games also used as the Void and the Expanded Worlds to kind of, do that kind of things, or, the more you're trying to like do something very tense, it's falling apart. And then I would spin that into being like the showdown. You guys keep rolling to see whether or not you're losing your cool, but every time you guys do a pair back and forth, now your GM intrusion goes from 1 to 2, 3 to 4, 5 to 6. And then whoever like breaks the GM intrusion first, they're the ones that lose the chicken. They fire first, or they.
That is awesome, and I'm stealing that now. It's being stolen, going to be used tomorrow. That is an awesome idea.
Thank you. I still have to think like, is that the person who loses the gun, or at that point do we roll and the guy loses something? Yeah, there's a little more tweaking, but that would be. What other kind of iconic moments do I want people to do? I mean, a good example was that Dean had was doing barrel rolls and using powers and things to do that. And then just go through and kind of make a list of the iconic little moments I want players to have access to that just, make it cool and definitely make it stand out compared to this is just your regular Cypher game. On the flip side, though, after that, I would go through them again and see which ones were still cool and maybe where I had just gotten lost in the weeds and went a little too deep and said, you know what, simplify that, or, just GM it on the fly, one of the two.
All right. So guys, we've hit that nail on the head and beat it to death, which is kind of cool. And I think everybody, I have to say, everybody, you guys all gave great feedback, wonderful ideas. Yes, Chris, your things are being stolen. Al, your stuff is stolen. You already know we bounce stuff off each other all the time.
I'm stealing all your guys' shit. I don't care.
So let's talk about mechanics versus the atmosphere versus the narrative. What's your approach versus, with that, mechanics versus the atmosphere versus the narrative? What do you say on that, Al?
Well, not to keep falling back to Darkest Dungeon, but mechanics definitely did play a big. I mean, at least in my eyes, a big role in capturing the feeling of crawling through a dungeon, of finding artifacts in the dungeon or whatever have you. Um, and that lent itself to the atmosphere where you felt like you were crawling through a dungeon. And it all feeds into each other. Again, this also helped the narrative because then doing the characters were doing things that would happen in a dungeon because they felt like they were there, they felt like their lives were in danger and whatever have you, and they were doing cool things based off that stuff. And again, I think they all play like a role with each other. It's almost like a yin yang, whatever the third one would be type deal, where without one you can't really have the other. And even though you guys might say the mechanics is probably the least important, again, I'm of that tangent where it's like almost as important. Where again, if you're converting or adapting a certain thing to a Cypher system, sometimes it might be necessary. But again, it's not always the case.
Anthony?
I'm going to exactly say what Al predicted I was going to say. I'm the exact opposite. To me, it's narrative. I come up with my story, the concept, and then I want a tone and pace. Once I have an idea of what I want my session to be, then I figure out, okay, how do I want to pace this? And then after I have the basic idea, not the story written out, but the basic tone and feel, what I'm trying to accomplish, whether I want you to be scared, whether I want you to be excited, the adrenaline pumping, then I worry about the mechanics. The mechanics are almost secondary to me, ultimately, which it's never a success. No, any GM that tell you that they have they run a perfect game every time, they're lying to your face. But I want to give you an experience that I'm trying to relay. And the mechanics, yeah, they help, and you need the mechanics to play the game, because if not, we're just role playing. But the narrative and the pace are way more important than the mechanics. And one of the examples I would give is that I could take a Cypher game and a Fate game, tell the same story, and still have fun. So that right there tells you I could tell the same exact story with two different rule sets, have them both be fun. So that right there tells you that the mechanics are secondary to the narrative and the pace.
Chris?
Well, coming from a lot of generic universe rules, I'm used to, forcing the atmosphere and the narrative to a point where we can kind of put the rules in the back. But now that I'm like designing, what I like to do is I like to have a few mechanics that GMs can have in a toolbox that, maybe they can pull out something special, but otherwise they can just put that toolbox to the side. I also, coming from the idea, you guys talk about doing a lot of one-shots. And from my angle, I'm not thinking of one-shots. I'm thinking about whatever I'm handing these guys, ladies and gentlemen, for their games, they're going to be doing other things with it. So I can't really enforce narrative as much, except when I do an adventure that kind of suggests where the narrative is going to go. A perfect example of that is, I don't know if you guys are familiar with Lamentations of the Flame Princess.
Yes, I am.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I'm the least knowledgeable person.
So it's a tiny little rule book. And if you just read it without any of the images, you discover it's basically basic Dungeons and Dragons. Dwarves are a class, elves are a class. You read the spells and you're kind of like, things don't, what? A first level character can summon a demon and it might eat their face off? And then when you see it with the art and their adventures, you totally get it, because especially the adventures sell it and their graphics sell it. Basically, it's all like heavy metal character art meets Cthulhu. Mm-hmm. You'll see fighters that are just like, ripping their face off as they're fighting with, some sort of insanity and stuff like that. So the rule set, in essence, doesn't support the atmosphere, but the setting and the adventures they supply do. So, that's kind of where designing a game, the fluff and the style of writing supports the narrative you want your GMs to be enticed to promote, because that's kind of where that comes from, is on the ground running. They have to kind of pull that out. So, just compared to a one-shot where kind of the game and the adventure and everything is just one solid module, nice smooth running engine is a one-shot compared to like something you design for other people. And when I play, like I said, I'd like to have some toolbox over here if I want to pull something out. But otherwise, narrative and atmosphere kind of go hand in hand for me.
Nice. And so what I'll say about that whole thing is I'm going to hit mechanics in the head first, because mechanics do have their place. There are a few systems out there that I truly love their mechanics. We talked about Savage Worlds earlier, Cortex or Cortex Prime, Fate, Powered by the Apocalypse, and, of course, Cypher. And I think when mechanics lend themselves to working within the narrative or supporting the narrative, I believe that's where the brilliance comes in. And I see that all the time when I say with Cypher. Their mechanics support, and not just support, but kind of drive you towards a more narrative, narrative aspect. And then the atmosphere comes into you as the GM. What are you trying to what are you trying to emote? My biggest thing is, like Anthony kind of, said that, we were talking about, being free form and stuff like that. But, we got to have some rails. We got to have some rules. My whole thing is the rail should never be and I'm going to say it, this is probably going to become my catchphrase, but the rail should never be the rails of a train track, but the rails of a roller coaster. I want my players to be able to feel like they're free within the confines of this world, no matter what the world is. So they're not necessarily confined. And I think the biggest thing, L, excellent at it, Anthony, excellent at it, Chris, you got to be excellent at it because you're making books and stuff, because you haven't run us in the game, and I'm going to keep harping on you because you run us in the game. But the most excellent thing that I'm saying is that you have to be excellent at never making your players feel like they're being railroaded or pushed down a specific path, but always have the ability to swing that loop back around to get it back on track to end, to the end game. Because we are telling a story. It's interactive storytelling. And I think good storytellers have that ability. They know how to let their players feel free and, just have a blast. I mean, I remember I ran a game based on Stephen King's The Mist, and it was all with shadows, everything. I didn't do The Mist, I did shadows. So everything was coming out of the darkness and all of this kind of stuff. And Anthony took the character. She was a militant New York City girl, moved to a small town, martial arts instructor, and I had it in the vision in my mind that, Fatima was going to be, the badass, and Anthony took the character totally zen. And it was great. It was beautiful. And I was able to still tell my story, even though the character was not the character I had initially designed, So that's my 2 cents.
So yeah, we've talked about all positives and stuff. We touched on some negatives about conversion, but what do you guys think some negatives are to adaptations? Any negative side effects or what have you to that? I can speak on that first. Well, one negative I've seen a lot with people is they get caught up on minutia of things, like how one certain thing should work or versus how another little thing should work. And adaptation should never be about converting these small minutia type things. You're trying to capture the atmosphere or the narrative of that thing that you're not converting but adapting. And if you get too caught up on the minutia, it bogs down the whole creative process, and that's one of the huge negatives I see a lot with people trying to make adaptations in Cypher System. But yeah, have you guys ever run across any negatives?
I think to touch on what you said, I think the biggest negative on adapting something as opposed to creating a rule for it is that sometimes it's too open to interpretation, if that makes any sense. And similar to like what Dean said, Dean could adapt something and then he'll tell 5 different people at the table, and all 5 people have a different vision of what Dean said in their head. So when it's my turn to do an action of something that he adapted, I might see something entirely different from the way Dean thought it out. And it creates confusion at the table, and it also breaks, it breaks the immersion when we have to stop the game and go, hey, well, I don't fully feel it works that way. Either you made it too powerful or you kind of nerfed it. That's not how it is in the movie, or that's not how it is in the setting. This doesn't fully relay. And we sort of experienced that when I ran Star Wars, and that was one of the reasons why I purposely didn't have lightsabers. Darth Vader was the only one that had a lightsaber, and it didn't really get it because I didn't want to say someone, a PC, to pick up a lightsaber and say, hey, nah, that's, Luke could cut through 5 walls. It doesn't work that way, without sitting there and actually figuring out a rule for lightsabers. So I think that's the biggest thing. I think that everyone would view it differently in their heads. And when you adapt something, it's not as well defined as a conversion. And and like it or not, when something's well defined, everyone tends to have the same view of what it's capable of doing.
I'm going to springboard off of what you said, Anthony. And I think kind of what you're getting at is, I think people who are coming from a specific mindset, that's where that breaks down at. If they're coming from the D&D mindset and they start trying to do adaptations.
That's a good point.
Yeah, they call themselves adapting, but they're still trying to convert. And so that's, I think, where the confusion comes in, because I think, definitively, like, you use your example of your Star Wars game, clean up in Sector 57. That was a beautiful example of keeping everybody within a box on their rails, but it was a freaking roller coaster because everybody knew kind of what we were and how we were going to do it and who we were going to be. But there was just still a plethora of everything out there. So I think the biggest negative to adaptation are people who don't fully embrace, the fact that you're kind of open to make this work within the confines of Cypher, because you can kind of rule it out, or add the right mechanics within the realms of Cypher to make it work, and also within the realms of your story. Because,
just to say this, and that's not a negative towards the players, because
no, not at all.
You don't understand something until you experience it. And if you haven't experienced it, it's unfair to say, they don't understand it if they haven't experienced adapting. And so if someone came from Pathfinder, that's the mindset they're going to have.
Right.
So
I'm not saying it's a negative to the players. I actually speak more towards the GMs, and only because, I think, I'm guilty. I'm dating myself again. Everybody knows I've been gaming since 1977. So I'm guilty of just that, because it took probably 15 years, 20 years into my gaming experience to start realizing, wait a minute, I'm bringing biases, I'm bringing minutia, as Al said, from previous stuff. And I'm not embracing what I have in front of me. And when I was able to break that mold and see that in myself, it's, like little advice that I try to give all game masters, whether you're running D&D, whether you're running, a Fate game, or whatever, embrace what's in front of you. Stop thinking about the stuff over there, because that stuff over there really doesn't matter. It matters what you're going to do now. So that's my one.
Chris, you have a negative for us?
Well, just before I get into that negative, the railroad thing, I've heard a similar comment in that sometimes players don't mind railroads. as long as you let them have their hands on the throttle and their hands on the whistle.
That's a good one too.
And the flaws to adaptation is that adaptations are more subjective. So you can argue a number back and forth, and somebody could just say, this is where the math's going to be, this is where I round it up, this is where I round it down, and people can go, oh, okay, I could get that. But when it's an adaptation, like I said, it's subjective. I've had a couple of times, I actually got teased for a while because it would be like, oh, there comes Chris again. He has a setting from one game, and he's using the rules from another game. Again.
And we call that around here Tuesday.
Tuesday, yes, exactly.
That's Tuesday night.
A perfect example is, one of, I think a lot of people can agree with this, that they love the craziness of a game world called Rifts, but are not thrilled with the rules.
I'm a Rifts fan. I'm sad to admit it, but
so
Savage Rifts.
It looks very tempting. It does. I took the Saga system, which when I talk about Saga, I'm not talking about Star Wars Saga. I'm talking about the Marvel Saga. It had cards, and then characters are quick to build, and fights were very cinematic and awesome, and we're playing cards. My players hated it.
No.
Hated it because
it's awesome. It's probably the best superhero systems ever.
Exactly. And my players were like, no, we liked the Rift system. They wanted to like basically min-max, and they wanted to like earn all those pluses and how kick-ass those pluses were. And then on another beat, there's this game called Mutants and Masterminds, which is like Dungeons and Dragons superheroes, which is awesome. And I was like, a generic system that uses D&D, which we'll get into that later about how people will be more than happy to learn new rules to an old system to the point it's not the same game, but they have that comfort level that they didn't have to learn a new game.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
So long story short, I would run science fiction, I would run fantasy, but a lot of my players were like, these rules are superhero rules. Yes, and we're adapting them to play other settings. But they couldn't do it. They wanted to make superhero characters. They were like, well, if I do this and this is a cool power. And I'm like, how did you even get that power set as a character in this setting? Well, I'm a mutant thingy, sort of, kind of. This is the third game we've played in this rule system and this other 3 different settings, and you come up with the same rule set. You're not playing a character, you're playing the awesome powers you want to play. And I'm like,
Can I play the devil's advocate? Because I've heard this argument many times. The person that says, hey, if you want to play such and such, why don't you use this system? Because it's designed specifically for that. You know, that's the argument you always hear when someone says, oh, hey, I want to run Cypher System. I want to run Cypher System Star Wars. But isn't there a Star Wars game that does that? Because isn't that the typical argument you hear?
That is a typical argument, and I think that goes back to me as a game master as a whole. Probably why most established setting games I don't touch. I don't care about the Lord of the Rings setting. I don't care about, now that Forgotten Realms has become, the standard bearer. I don't care. I really like creating worlds. I think creating worlds is just so cool. And, I guess, my biggest thing is, and I tell people all the time, the Cypher system is elegant in its simplicity. And that's what I dig about it. And I can play whatever I want within that elegance.
Yeah.
So some of those answers are because the game system we like doesn't have the IP we want to play. Number one. Number two, maybe I like to just, some people want to start a conversation on a forum and I want to do this setting with this rules sort of thing. Or, again, with like Rifts, like the setting, not so much a fan of the rules.
I played a ton of Rifts in high school, trust me, I know it.
Palladium games.
The most
Especially in the 90s.
Yeah. Heroes Unlimited was like my go-to. I ran everything in Heroes Unlimited. That was like my go-to system.
Again, a superhero system being used as a generic rule set. It's not a bad idea. But if you're, a lot of players, they just could not separate. Here's the flip question, in that, a lot of players, their setting has to match the rule set. If there's a disconnect, they have a huge disconnect. I'm even guilty of it myself.
It's like what you said with mutants and masterminds. A lot of people don't understand. Mutants and masterminds just use, like you said, they just use the core mechanics of D&D. Mutants and masterminds was nothing but champions scaled back, because you could do just like champions. You built power arrays and this, that, and the third. And I played a lot of champions. So when I saw what they did, I'm like, oh, they simplified a lot of the math. Oh,
put in built-in power limits.
Built-in power limits. Oh, wait, look, level. Oh, this is, and that's all there was.
So this is a question that's maybe not necessarily in the field of what our video is, but I'm just curious about this. For the exception of the generic systems, like let's take out the GURPS, let's take out the Fates. What do you think is a system that's the easiest to adapt?
Face rip. The old Marvel superhero system, face rip.
Oh,
fighting. Face rip stands for fighting, agility, strength, endurance, reason, intuition, and psyche. And those abilities were based on percentages, and I could adapt just about anything I wanted to that, because everything just had a definitive line, and you had the universal chart, so you didn't even really have to figure out numbers. It was all on a chart. You roll up 90%, monstrous result. Hey, that was one of my favorite systems.
Chris, you got a.
There wasn't a generic system already, right?
Yes.
Well, I would have to go with the Marvel Saga system, and the Mutants and Masterminds. Those were two good ones, and of course, superhero, right? And another one I have that has been tempting me to try is there is a game called Amazing Adventures, which is a pulp. Dude, we got to do beer, I swear. It takes the D20 pseudo retro clone, whatever you want to call it, Castles and Crusades, which is, it takes D20 and turns it into kind of like an advanced Dungeons and Dragons flavor. Very streamlined, very simplified, and they put it to pulp rules. And that with its companion book, I mean, in the back they go like how you could do this, that, and the other with it, which is a spin on. I always thought that even D&D itself, you could so do John Carter of Mars just by renaming things. You take the magic, you make it psionics. Instead of dungeons, you go into ruins. Magic items are technology. Flying carpets are your little hover bike things, and boom, you're done. So that I've always seen to be is kind of like a potential, system that was made for pulp, but we turned into like doing almost anything with a very streamlined D20 feel to it.
I wanted to pick a fantasy setting, and the first thing that came to mind was 5e. But the more I think about it, I will probably go with Dungeon Crawl Classics.
Good stuff.
I think it's a scaled down version of fantasy that is easier to strip and adapt to, and I think with some time I could probably do most settings with Dungeon Crawl Classics.
You're set up now because now there's Mutant Crawl Classics out, right?
Yeah.
So you have the science, and half their stuff even before Mutant Crawl Classics. On PDF, I have the Atomic Overmind. I have the Purple Planet, which is a John Carter of Mars on like freaking acid. Like if Michael Moorcock was like, I'm gonna, make my own, setting. Also, they did one that was Appalachian flavored, like all the Appalachian mythologies. Chained Coffin was pretty cool. Those are some, I'm with you there. I have one of my bucket list things is to actually do a Dungeon Crawl Classics adventure and go through all those books. Oh, and they also I've got the PDFs for the Lankmar stuff that just came out.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's very adaptable.
And I haven't really been playing games too long. You must know this already. Any what is it? Viewers we have most likely already know that I'm new to all this, so I don't really have all this experience with different systems. However, I have thought a lot about lasers and feelings, where it's more
Oh,
that's like what is it, a sci-fi space opera thing? But
yeah.
I've thought about using it in other ways, like for pirates and stuff like that, where it's a very simple thing and it's easy to adapt it to different settings. Because, well, for
Lady Blackbird.
the pirate example, it'll
Misdirected marks, Rockaboys and vending machine.
yeah, and the pirate one I was thinking about would be pistols and panache, where you're either good with a gun or good, at, flavorful, or whatever, like a talker. But either way, that would be my like system that has a set thing, but we can use it for other things. Would be lasers and feelings, because I love that shit. But
like that too.
thank you
Yeah, I
all.
apologize for.
Go on.
I'm sorry.
So, no,
I said I just want to apologize for stepping on you and did it twice.
Ah.
But yeah, if you like lasers and feelings, check out Lady Blackbird. That's pretty good.
Have you seen any of our videos? We stepping on each other halfway through the video. Don't worry about it.
But yeah, this is a great discussion. Thank you all for watching, whoever may be watching. I feel like we hit on a lot of good topics, and thank you very much, GanzaGaming, for joining us. Chris, we'll be sure to add your links and stuff to your social media down below. But if you want, you can just let us know where can we find you on the internet?
Well, you can find me on Twitter at Christopher Robin Neg, N-E-G, the short for my last name, which is Negline. I have my nowadays I'm not so sure I want to put out my personal Facebook because I don't have a professional one, because my professional one just hung there, didn't do anything. But you can find Esper Genesis 5e, and I'm hanging out there, supporting that stuff. Yes, thank you very much. That is a beautiful cover.
Yes,
you guys have to see it in person. I'm trying to think, what else did I do? I'm trying to remember what my Instagram is, actually, off the top of my head. But we'll put it in the link below.
Yes,
I generally, and Instagram, we do some Esper Genesis promotion, but I take a couple of pictures here and there that look kind of cool. Go from there.
Twitter?
Yeah,
Twitter is at Christopher Robin Neg.
Yeah. So again, we'll have all those links down below, and thank you again for watching. It's been a pleasure. We'll have be sure to like, share, and subscribe. And yeah, thank you, Anthony. Thank you, Dean. Thank you, Chris, again. And yeah, from us at the CU, we'll see you later. Have a good night, guys.